whatever, we have to know that we do have inroads, but it is about how we treat other people.
Yeah. Yep.
So could we, if we could get meetings with CDPH, could we get them to consider genetic history and these other, could we get them to adopt that as a way of evaluating these exemptions?
So yes-ish. I think we could. I think my guess is it will be in the appeals process. And, we would love to have that, as I talked about the Knox-Keene Act, the appeals process there. We would love to have that mirrored. I'm not sure how much, again, I think the CDPH has a lot of power in this, but at the same time, I don't know how much power they have, and I don't know how much they can determine what goes, what they use. I think there will be internal criteria that they use. I think we could influence that, but I think ultimately it's up to them. And that's why, we would really like a bill next year that has that information in it, so that it is clear. The SB276, I was saying this to somebody this morning, I read it probably 50 times the last 2 days, trying to interpret it for what happens in each grade point, and also to do our analysis of it. We'll do a point-by-point analysis of each section. But it is so poorly written. Like, my kid, if they submitted that to school, would get an F in it, because it is so circuitous, it is so vague, it is so duplicative in different ways. It is a mess. It is written so poorly. And our legislature should honestly be ashamed to have put a piece of writing into our statute that is that poor. And it was a rush job. I mean, that's why it's so poor, because it was a rush job. And Senator Pan wasn't willing to clean it up. He wasn't willing to take amendments to make it what it should have been. And it really is, it's shameful. They should be ashamed. It's a poor piece of literature or legislation. I think the other piece of it is there is so much gray area and undefined things that we will never know what it is. The CDPH put out a question and answer on SB276. It was part of the email that we sent out yesterday with our analysis of what happens to your kid, and it is completely broad. There's nothing about 2020. You're either grandfathered in or you're not grandfathered in. And I'm like, okay, let's, I'm sure they will that. But, let's go with that. We put it out as this is the worst case scenario of what happens. And this is what, if you read the law, this is what it says. But if CDPH doesn't go with that, then great.
Yeah.
Things like what you're asking is, would they take would they take any of this into consideration? I think the answer is yes. How much influence we have, I don't know. I think the other piece of this is, they have to define some of it, because right now, again, I'll use a high school analogy. Right now, the way the bill is written is, my child's teacher says, we're learning biology this year. There are 8 topics that we are going to study. You need to write a paper on each of those 8 topics. You need to go research the internet. You can use whatever resources you want. You need to submit each paper, your topic. It comes into her, and she then goes, oh, okay, I have my 5 points that you have to have covered. If you haven't covered, you'll get 20% for each point.
Oh.
You've only covered one of them, you failed. It's reviewed. I've reviewed it and I've revoked it. That's not a way to, the doctors have no idea what they should be submitting. They have no idea what they should be submitting. Yeah. In the appeals process, they should have no idea what they should be submitting firsthand. And so it's a catch-22 situation, because this, the person that's reviewing it, they have their criteria, but nobody knows what those criteria are. I'm hoping that they do. Well, I'm hoping one of 2 things, that they do expand it and define what that actually is. But furthermore, I really hope we have a bill next year that we get to define what that is. And what we're suggesting is not something that is way out there. It's something that's already in statute. It's something that is kind of why wouldn't you vote on that? Why wouldn't you say yes to defining what should go into a medical exemption? It's already in our, healthcare statute. So, why wouldn't you use the same thing? So that's the...
Yeah. The Knox-Keene Act is a federal appeal.
No, it's a California State Act.
Oh, okay. So it's actually a piece of legislation that governs appeals to the medical board or to this?
No, to the healthcare insurance industry.
Oh, to the okay, great.
Yeah.
So it's already like precedent.
Yeah, and that's why we chose it. I mean, we chose it because it fits, but we also chose it because it's used every day, day in and day out. The Knox-Keene Act, I think, was enacted in 1975. So I don't know when the appeals process piece of it was enacted, but it's used, day in, day out.
Right. Okay. And so it can be easily fit into.
Yeah.
And CDPH would be comfortable using it because it's tested over 20.
We would hope so. Yeah. Okay. We would hope so.
Great.
So again, we have no idea whether that's something that they would include or not.
So at this point, A Voice for Choice is attempting to get meetings with head of CDPH.
Yes, we are trying to.
Okay.
I don't know how successful. We were not successful during after SB277 with doing that. I don't know whether they are, and we specifically are hoping that they will meet with doctors who are doing this. We would like to meet with them because we feel like we're one of the most knowledgeable about the actual bill, because I've sat there and I've read through this, and that's part of what what as an organization, or Voice for Choice Advocacy, always really likes to get it into the nitty gritty of what does this mean, and how does it affect you, and how can we help you get through it? If you fall into this, what's going on, how can we help you? Those are all probably three things that I would say Voice for Choice Advocacy sort of excels at. And so for me, I would like to be in that meeting, or one of our lobbyists that has also been, in the weeds on this, as well as doctors that are actually doing this, because it's those doctors that can say, but if you do that, this is what's going to happen. This is what happens in, this is my practice. And, the doctors that we would ask to meet with them are doctors that vaccinate in their practice. They're one of the only doctors in their area that will do medical exemption evaluations, because other doctors just won't do it anymore. And the majority of other doctors won't even see, partially vaccinated kids. Every kid has to be fully vaccinated in most practices. And so, you're left with a group that sees not fully vaccinated kids. They're not completely unvaccinated, most of them, but sees these kids, and many of them are vaccine injured. Many of them are not being vaccinated fully because they've had a reaction.
Right.
So this smaller group of doctors, and then within that you have a tiny group of doctors that are actually willing to stick their necks out and do medical exemption evaluations.
Right. Wow. It's pretty amazing the breadth of what you do. It's on many levels. I'm curious, do you interact with the medical board as well? I mean, you probably go to these meetings regularly.
Yes. That's one place where I'm glad that 100 people showed up at the last one, because I'm hoping the same thing happens as it happened with the ACIP meeting, which was, I used to be the only person, me and one other person used to be the only people that showed up for the ACIP meetings. And then Dell got wind of them. Dell went one time, and now they've changed the whole process for public comment. It used to be that you could come and speak for 3 minutes on every single agenda item. They've now changed it to 20 minutes, and it's a lottery of who gets picked to talk. So I no longer go, because the likelihood of me getting picked is, slim to none, and there are other people that need to speak out, and I don't need to travel to Atlanta 4 times a year, 3 times.
Wow.
But the medical board is the same thing. That's the other thing that I would say to everybody in every state is, go to your medical board meetings, go make them aware that you're there. I mean, just to sit there and that they see that you're watching them, that you're listening to what they say. So it used to be that there are 3 people that go to every California medical board meeting. I only go to the ones, there are 2 in the Northern California area every year, and there are 2 in Southern California. So I only go to the ones in Northern California. I listen in. The other cool thing with the medical board meetings is you can listen and comment on the phone. So I listen into them and comment on the phone. But usually it's me, one person that has a big thing about CMA collusion with the medical board. And then there's another woman who advocates for Black patient rights. They're discriminated against by white doctors.
Yeah.
It used to be the three of us would go, and I would always talk on the witch hunt and the vaccination issue. But I would say that's another place that, I don't interact with the medical board on a sort of individual medical board level. I only give public comment. We've asked for things to be put on the agenda. They haven't been put on the agenda. But other than that, we don't really have interaction with the actual medical board members.
So if you're a layperson like me, no affiliated to any organization, how at this point would I even bother to interact with the medical board? You
go and give public comment.
So can our public comment be on investigations of our doctors?
They can. They won't go into, they don't like you bringing up, or they tell you not to bring up specific details. So if you have questions like, you accused him of doing this, I don't think that's right, they're not going to, well, first of all, they can't respond. You're just giving comment. But they won't, they don't take up like individual, like if you say that, they'll be like, that's not something that we deal with here. You need to go through whatever the process is. But you can bring up, you're investigating these two doctors. We have an issue with what you're, one of the things that I will be saying at the next medical board meeting is, what is standard of care? Can we have a meeting? Can we have an agenda item on what is standard of care? Because your definition of standard of care is very different from what standard of care is. And, the Mayo Clinic came out with a study that said standard of care from 10 years ago, only 40% of that is standard of care today. My extrapolation of that is, if you were in medical school 10 years ago, that's when you learned standard of care.
Yeah.
Your standard of care today is still from 10 years ago. You may have done research in certain areas and brought, some of that up to speed. And hopefully in your specialty, you've brought some of that up to speed. But let's take a pediatrician. Their standard of care that they learned 10 years ago is likely what they're practicing today in their practice.
Yeah.
So and that's, the medical board sees standard of care not as cutting, to me, standard of care should include cutting edge. It should include the latest research, the latest technology, the latest. But realistically, standard of care is what 99% of doctors are doing for that, issue, for that symptom, for that disease. And to me, that's not, I get that that's standard of care, but then we need to change the language, because standard of care shouldn't shouldn't exclude the people that have moved on from standard of care to what's going to be standard of care in 10 years time. These people just haven't caught up with it.
Well, who holds standard of care? Because that's one of the questions that I got.
It is, yeah.
That's a word that floats out there, and people are like,
yeah,
who actually defines that?
So when you're up in front of the medical board as a doctor, the medical board defines standard of care.
And if standard of care is established by doctors individually by when they graduate from medical school.
Yeah. And I think it's what's being taught in medical school as well. It's somewhat currently. I mean, I think it's if you, and I don't know how they actually define it, but I don't know actually how they work out what is standard of care. What is, for the vaccination issue, what is standard of care?
Yeah.
How they define that. I think from a perspective of a physician, it's what the majority of physicians are doing to treat that disease, to treat that symptom.
Who holds that body of knowledge then?
I think, and now that we have the internet, a lot of it is on the internet. I think it's in conferences, what's being talked about in conferences and shared information. So, how do we move on to, let's take something like the breast cancer gene. 15 years ago, we didn't know about the breast, I'm making the numbers up, but let's just say 15 years ago, we didn't know about the breast cancer gene. Actually, we probably did 15 years ago, but it wasn't widely used. Let's go 30 years ago. We didn't know about the breast cancer gene. We knew people were getting breast cancer. The treatment for breast cancer was X, Y, and Z. We then found out about the breast cancer gene and started testing people for the breast cancer gene. That makes it a very different standard of care, because what do you do if you know you have the breast cancer gene? You now have options. You now have a different decision tree, so to speak, what you're going to do. People who get breast cancer today, are very different what their standard of care is. And I think it's that evolution, and it's not at the standard of care is not at the cutting edge of that. It's many years behind of what people are actually doing for that, you know. And I think in the vaccination issue, we are probably we know there are some genes that affect, or some family history that affect how you react to vaccinations. But we've got all of the, you know, we've got 20 years probably, hopefully not that long, because we're in a lot faster moving pace and with genetics and all of that. But, you know, we've got probably at least 5-10 years. I actually think at some point, and, you know, it's another thing that in the back of my mind that I'm working on, but it's working on by itself back here in the back of my head, is some form of genetic risk, some form of vaccine risk protocol screening. So some form of screening, like we do screening of newborns, infants, you know, first day they get a foot prick to see what they've got genetically. I would love to see, don't give a vaccine until you've done some form of test and you've evaluated the risk based purely on genetics of what the risk of vaccine injury is for that child at that point. And you know, that I think we will get there. I think we're far away, but we're not too far away. I think we're headed in that direction, but we have to take standard of care to include the people that are on that cutting edge, that are making the changes, because they're pushing us to new standard of care.
Right. So then when people ask what is standard of care, the CDPH is going to take it and they're going to collectively decide together what their interpretation of standard of care is?
I hope so. I think they will get input from the medical board as well. I hope so. My fear is that they will leave it to the one person that is in charge of this to work out what standard of care is. Oh. And it will be up to that person to define standard of care, and up to 3 appeals physicians to define what standard of care is. And
will they write that down so that we can actually see that?
I think we will see it in the appeals process. I think we'll see it in the same way we're seeing it with the medical board.
Yeah.
You know, Dr. Stoller's accusation makes it clear that his genetic testing is not what they consider standard of care. And he actually is going to file a lawsuit questioning what is standard of care. I mean, I don't know whether I think he filed it already. I think
right.
But basically asking what is standard of care, who gets to define standard of care, and you know, when is standard of care updated? When is it, you know, when does it become antiquated? When does your standard of care is not real standard of care from my practice? My practice is with vaccine injured children, and so my standard of care is different from a pediatrician that just vaccinates and doesn't see any vaccine.
It stands to reason that a physician could defend themselves by defining this is standard of care in my practice. I utilize XYZ studies to make my decisions, just like Stoller is using studies that are peer reviewed and published to essentially decide what his standard of care is. If there's no defining body that's saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is standard of care and nothing else matters, or XYZ study is standard and nothing else matters.
Right. And that, I think, is I think, yes, the answer is yes. The question is, will the medical board, will CDPH actually allow that, or will pharma influence them? And will they say, no, we're sticking with the CDC? The CDC is our God. It's, you know, we're sticking with that, and we will wait for them to update their policies. Then we will update our policies. And I don't, you know, to me, I think Stoller has a case, and I think he may have more chance of winning it against the medical board, because that's not actually statute. That's the medical board and how the medical board defines standard of care.
Okay.
I think with CDPH, I think it's going to be interesting, and I think it's going to be harder. And I think, you know, all of these things mesh into one another. And so I think we actually will be able to, I think we'll come out, you know, it's a long-term game. It's not something that we're going to have influence on next week, next year. You know, we may, because of our legislation, have a little bit of influence on it, but I really think it's, you know, it's a long term, and it's different pieces of the puzzle that come together. You know, whatever happens in Stolar's case, if it's positive, we use that. Whatever happens over here, we use that. You know, it's picking all of these pieces and putting them together into a package that says, look, here's our standard of care. So I think it's a matter of seeing what happens. I think we're moving in the right direction. We absolutely are moving in the right direction. It's just, you know, it's not as easy as just saying, here we go, here's the answer. Everybody pick up the answer and run with it.
Yeah. Well, it's crazy to say use standard of care when there's actually no standard. No common ground.
In a way it's a moving target, but it's actually not a moving target. You know, it's a moving target year to year. But as I said, my belief is that a physician's standard of care, and I've talked to physicians about this, you know, what is standard of care? And what we've come out with a conclusion of is your standard of care is when you went to medical school and whatever continuing education you've done in whatever field you've done. But if you've done, you know, if you went to general medical school and then you've done an interest in, you know, kidneys, let's say, and nephrology, your nephrology standard of care may have moved on, but everything else is still stuck when you were in medical school because you haven't learned anything more on that standard of care. And so it's a really interesting question of what is standard of care.
Right, it very much is. I really didn't realize it was such a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
We were all operating that there was some written Bible out there, and there really isn't.
No.
So for people whose doctors are being targeted, recently Sears has had the military insurance insurer pull him as a practitioner. He's out apparently lots of money because I don't know, this I don't have exact story on, but apparently they pulled him and they're not reimbursing him for visits that he did perform. I don't know if you know this or not, but people whose doctors are now being investigated, which I think is really most publicly is Stolar and Sears. Is there a way that they can influence or through medical board meetings or whatever to support this process with these doctors?
So let's go into let's talk Charity Dean and sort of start. I'm going to start from 2016 and why our doctors are in this position. So in 2016, Charity Dean was the Santa Barbara health officer. She basically took it upon herself to audit all of the schools and pull the medical exemptions from those schools. Now, we found out about it because one of the parents found out that their medical exemption had been shared. And there was what's called a FERPA violation, which FERPA is the Federal Privacy Act, that says that if you can hand over, as a public school especially, you can hand over any documents that have to do with your children's records, but you have to redact all the personal information. So you have to redact their name, date, social security number, age, and even information that says, you know, if it says because of his brother Kyle, you know, blah, 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 anaphylaxis, you're supposed to take that out, because if you know what school the child goes to, if you know that they have a brother called Kyle, well, then you know who the kid is. Or even things like if the child has cancer or if the child is in a wheelchair. You know, if you're at that school, you know the child who has cancer or the child that's in a wheelchair. So that's identifying information. So anything that could personally identify that child should be taken out. So when these schools gave the first round of medical exemptions to Charity Dean, they were not redacted. And so there has been a FERPA complaint made. It is coming through this month, I believe. It's finally being finalized. The issue is it takes 3 years, and all they get is a slap on the wrist saying, yep, you violated this. Please don't do it again. You know, go read your FERPA, you know, how to do these, you know, how to redact information. So it really doesn't do very much for them. We broke the story in 2016, A Voice for Choice Advocacy, and we basically did hundreds of Public Record Act requests. And what we found was, we first did them of Charity Dean and CDPH and her local health officer organization. And what we found was this teleconference that Lee has now amplified, but this teleconference of local health officers that basically said, Charity Dean was saying, I'm putting in place a medical exemption pilot program, and I want every county to do this. And so then we were like, holy crap, they're basically culling, and in that on that conference call, they said it doesn't matter if the kids' information is redacted, because what we're really after is the doctors, and the doctor information doesn't have to be redacted. So we went out and we did PRA requests of every county in California, their health officers, the health departments. And we said, are you participating in a medical exemption pilot program? Have you had any information about it? If you have, what is your plan? Basically all of this stuff. And we found at that point, I think probably seven different counties were going to do this medical exemption pilot program. And they basically were culling information. It was all about getting medical exemptions. Other health officers, county health officers did it independently, and basically would go into schools that either had high medical exemption numbers or had high, or didn't report. They would say, oh, we're coming in to look at them just to understand, whether they're legitimate or not. And so they would go into the schools and actually look at them there, and they would write down the names of the doctors. So it's a big program. They then, in 2017, the medical board somehow got all of these doctors' names that had written medical exemptions and sent them all a letter saying, we are watching you. Please make sure, we know you've written a medical exemption, at least one. We are watching you, and please make sure you dot your I's and cross your T's, and that you are getting all the necessary medical records that you need to write medical exemptions. And so they're basically, we're kind of giving them a heads up, like, if you're doing this, we're watching you, make sure you dot all your I's, cross all your T's. But at the same time, to me, it was a witch hunt. And that, if you look on our YouTube channel, you can see that I've talked to the medical board about that witch hunt many times. At that point, that was the point where so many doctors said, we're not doing medical exemption evaluations anymore. We just can't do it. It's clear the medical board has their eye on us. We're not doing it anymore. And so it reduced greatly the number of medical exemption evaluation doctors that did that. We then kind of, it was kind of like, we know this is going on. It isn't illegal. It's not really legal, but it's not illegal what they're doing. There are a few things that Lee brought up that we hadn't sort of identified, which is that they actually were colluding, that if they put these doctors into under investigation, then you can hide all of the information surrounding this, because it's suddenly part of a legal case, which an investigation basically is. And so that piece of the collusion Lee kind of got into, and I was just like, oh wow, I didn't even, like, we saw it as, they're doing this, there's not much that we can do. They're doing it legally. They can go into the schools, they can look at this, they can request the medical exemptions as long as they're redacted. So we didn't really see a way. We saw it as bad, but we didn't see it as a way going, to do anything. I was sitting in the last medical board hearing, and one of the three people that's always there, his big thing is the collusion between the CMA and the California Medical Board. So the CMA is a trade organization for physicians. They represent 26,000 physicians, or they have 26,000 physicians as members out of 140,000 licensed physicians in the state. So they represent less than 20%. Most of their physicians are either right out of school doctors that, I know when I came out of school and I became a market researcher, it was you join whatever trade organizations there are, and you go to their conferences and you're all involved. And then after about 3 years, you're like, this is a complete waste of money. It's not doing anything for me. And they don't represent me really, and don't do it anymore. So the CMA represent that, but the CMA has huge amounts of money. Every Kaiser doctor is part of the CMA, and Kaiser pays their $1,200 dues. So it is very much made up of Kaiser doctors or coming in doctors. So the CMA represents 20% of the physicians that are out there, but yet on the medical board, we're now up to 60% of the physicians on the medical board are either past CMA board members, presidents, or members of the CMA, have something, big at the CMA. So they are disproportionately represented, the CMA, and the CMA is who brings forward legislation. They're disproportionately represented there. And so he was talking about this at the last medical board, and it just all kind of clicked in my brain. And I was just like, wow, like, you've got the medical board that is mostly CMA. You have Charity Dean, who last year, it sort of all clicked. Charity Dean last year was promoted by Governor Brown to the number 3 position in CDPH. She was the CMA's Person of the Year last year.
Oh.
I was just like, wow, this bill is Charity Dean's like payroll. It's her like rising up through the ranks. This bill was made for her in that position at CDPH. Like there's no other way. Like she started it and she's gotten it rolling. She got herself in this position. I can guarantee you next year that she's the person that takes this over, unless something happens. It's what she's primed herself for. She's put herself in this position. And so I kind of put all this together, and we released a press release that had it. And that's what, Lee Dundas sort of saw that and was just like, oh my God, like, let's dig into this further. And I'm glad that she did. And I'm glad that she sort of amplified it and taken it further.
Great job.
It is a real problem. And I think it's probably one of our biggest problems is that Charity Dean is involved in this, because she has a whole side of it that is completely her perspective, and her, brain will be put into this versus it being just somebody who got hired for the position and is kind of like, yep, I'm going to treat everyone equally here. Like I'm going to completely, equal.
She's not going to run that agency or that department objectively. She obviously has a bent on people that vaccinate, on doctors that use updated standard of care or updated research. So she, and coming from the CMA, it's interesting to hear that they're mainly Kaiser doctors, because you would think, where is pharma in that?
Well, Kaiser gets a lot of pharma funding.
So essentially
CMA gets a lot of pharma funding. So I was looking at their numbers. They have $12 million that comes in subscription dues. So one person is $1,200. And I will say, so there are 26,000 physicians that CMA represents. They say their total number is about 44,000, but the remainder of those are people in medical school or in pharmaceutical school, or they're basically students. And, we've seen at the hearings, all the students file in from UC Davis, and I'm sitting there going, okay, you're not even doctors yet. Like you're pharmacologists. Like you're not, like you're in your white coats, but your white coats really don't mean anything right now.
Right.
And so, they get $12 million from subscription, and they get $1 million from basically, I don't remember what the line item is in their report, but it's basically pharma grants, pharma funding.
Yeah, they don't actually represent physicians in private practice.
No, and they don't even represent most physicians, I would say, that are in
general
insurance-based practice.
Right.
Well, I don't think I think they represent a lot of Kaiser, and I only know this because I know Kaiser pays for every doctor, if they want to be part of the CMA, they pay for their subscription as part of being part of Kaiser. So I know that, a huge number of Kaiser doctors are part of it just because Kaiser pays for it, not because their individual doctor feels that they need to be a part of CMA.
Wow.
Yeah.
Time to get rid of Kaiser as an insurer. There's the Frontier Medical.
It will be incredibly hard. I don't think that will ever.
No, I mean, as your own, there's always that.
Your own. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you have insurance, I would not go with Kaiser. I mean, but they have a good, like, I like the concept of how they practice.
Yeah.
The actual Kaiser, just no. It's one of the worst companies to be open to alternative practices on any front,
Right. Okay, so my original question was, how can people support their doctors like Sears?
Sorry.
That's okay. I mean, it's good to know the background of what we're up against, and that the medical board is built with CMA doctors and such. But we also, people are really worried about doctors who have been willing to adopt updated research like Stoller and Sears and been put their neck out. So is there a way that we can have some sort of impact to support them? Yeah,
so I think continuing to sort of give them love and support in that way. I would say the other place that I would support them is we need more doctors writing medical exemptions and doing medical exemption evaluations. I mean, we've gotten to the point where, I said in 2015 15, 16. We need 1,000 doctors writing 10 medical exemptions, not 10 doctors writing, or, we need 400 doctors writing 10 medical exemptions, not 10 doctors writing 400 medical exemptions. And that's the place that it is really easy for the medical board to take down, the 20 doctors that are doing this. Really, they will be looked at as heroes for getting these 20 doctors. Okay. If there were 400 doctors or 200 doctors that were writing medical exemptions, they wouldn't be able to bring down 200 doctors. If they did, they would look so stupid. They would look so ridiculous. Like, what? You just told 200 doctors they're not doing the right thing? Yeah. But my feeling is to empower doctors, and it's part of our legislation for next year, is to bring in this expanded criteria so doctors feel confident writing medical exemptions based on research, based on genetics, based on family history, and really giving them that groundwork. And, I think it's having a conversation with every MD or physician that you are, or DO, that you are in contact with, and saying, I get you don't feel comfortable doing this, but if we can get more doctors doing this, okay, fine. In 2 years' time, or next year, agree to write 4 medical exemptions and make sure they're for kids that are in schools that are above 95% vaccination level. That's a lot of kids. That's a lot of medical exemptions that could be written, and you will not get flagged. You will not get reviewed. So if we could get doctors writing those 4, that's my first step is, how do we get these doctors, how do we get more doctors out there understanding? I mean, the first piece is understanding that there are risks, understanding that it is more than just CDC. I think the other piece is, and, this is another piece of legislation that we've been thinking about, and we don't know how quite to implement it, but basically so right now, the reason why most doctors don't take non-fully vaccinated kids is because of health insurance. The health insurance companies and it comes from pharma, but they're giving them bonuses to have their kids fully up to date and fully vaccinated. I would like to see doctors have some form of continuing education on vaccine injury, on reporting to VAERS, on having, the people who have medical exemptions don't count towards your target numbers. You can say you're 100% vaccinated, your kids are 100% as vaccinated as they can be. That's a great answer. That's what I would like to see, rather than my kids are 100% vaccinated. We know there are some kids that cannot be vaccinated fully, that will have reactions. So for you to be proud of your practice having 100% vaccination rate, I wouldn't be proud of that, because it means you're not doing your due diligence on vaccines. You don't understand that there will be people in your practice that are injured by vaccines. Right. And you shouldn't push them out of your practice. So it's changing that dynamic. It's changing the rhetoric there. That will support our doctors that are, at the moment sticking their necks out.
Well, shouldn't we also get something in the legislation that prevents pharma from bonusing doctors for doing things that injures people?
Yes.
To bonus, if practices are deciding on their patient content based on their financial gain, it just seems to me.
Yeah, and that's not only vaccines. There are there's research out there. Actually, I was part of research that came out that we did many, many years ago. We actually did it for a pharmaceutical company because they wanted to understand it, but then they didn't publish it ever. But it basically, the question was, as a physician, how much are you influenced by the pharma reps that come to your office? And it's to the point now where a pharma rep will come and they will say, this is our product. We'll give you bonuses for handing, for prescribing this product. Unbelievable. And they give bonuses. They can't give physical bonuses, but they can give free samples. So you're getting paid for the sample, but they're actually free. I don't know exactly how it works, but it basically the doctor
you can sell the drug where on the back end you're buying it for free.
Exactly.
You're not actually buying it. You can sell it.
And what the drug reps will do is they have access to the pharmaceutical records. And so they will go to the pharmaceutical records and see, Dr. X, last month he prescribed twice as much of the competing drug as our drug. why is he doing that? Let me go in and let me go sell him, you know, let me go do my little pharma rep thing. We're going to get him buying our drug. So, you know, I think all of that should be, you know, and that's just regular drugs. That's not vaccines. I think all of that needs to just go away. Like the whole pharma rep business, I would say there are three pieces of it. There's the whole pharma rep business that just needs to go away. The doctor needs to prescribe based on what they believe. I'm fine with the pharma rep giving information on the drug, but the doctor should be able to say, okay, I've got this drug and this drug. Oh, you know, for this patient, this one is actually better. This one is this one, not being based on the sales pitch that they got that morning. That's one place. I think the pharmaceutical advertising. So we're one of two countries, us and New Zealand, that allow pharmaceutical advertising on TV. And I think that needs to be gotten rid of. We need to get pharma out of the media. You know, it's the reason why we can't get a balanced story on the 9 o'clock news, because pharma owns the media waves. I've told many times, oh, well, we can't interview you because you know, lose our advertising money. The third one is the pharmaceutical lobby money, that you have to get the money out of politics. Those three things. If we could change those three things, we would be in a completely different landscape.
Well, we have 1 minute for your hard stop. We didn't get into real next steps. We could set up a different time and